It was supposed to be a fresh start. We'd both been wrapped up in our own worlds, her with work, me with the constant demands of the house, so I thought a trip might reignite something. Plus, it had been a while since we'd done anything just for us. No kids, no interruptions, just the two of us for a whole weekend. I figured it could give us a chance to reconnect, to remember why we started this journey together in the first place. We hadn't done much planning. This was my surprise for her. I kept it simple, booking a cozy spot at a resort a few hours from home. She'd seemed genuinely excited when I told her. That glimmer in her eyes felt almost nostalgic, a reminder of the early days. The drive was mostly quiet, but not uncomfortable. She dozed off as the sun set, and I found myself glancing over at her, feeling some of the old affection bubbling up. I brushed off any thoughts that maybe she'd been distant lately, thinking this weekend would change everything. We'd eat, laugh, talk about anything but responsibilities, just be together. By the time we got to the resort, it was nearly dark. She perked up immediately, talking about how she loved the rustic vibe of the place. As we walked through the lobby, she clutched my arm and smiled up at me, a real smile, like the old days. I thought maybe we were finally on the right path back to each other. The next day, we were having breakfast in the resort's little dining area. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room, and everything seemed to settle into place. I remember thinking how perfect it felt. Then, out of nowhere, I noticed her look up from her plate, her eyes widening slightly. She was staring past me, her expression unreadable. Curious, I turned around to see what had caught her attention. Standing a few tables away was a man around our age, leaning on a chair, talking animatedly with a group of people. He had this confident air about him, someone you'd assume knew everyone in the room. Then I glanced back at her and caught that unmistakable look on her face, a mix of recognition and something else I couldn't quite place. "Do you know him?" I asked, more casually than I felt. "Oh, yeah," she stammered, her cheeks turning a little pink. "That's Jason. We went to high school together." "Really?" I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. "He was actually my first boyfriend," she added, laughing nervously. "Crazy coincidence, right?" I chuckled along, even though something about the whole situation was starting to feel off. She seemed flustered, which wasn't like her at all. Normally, she'd have waved, maybe introduced us if she knew the person well. But she just kept glancing over, like she didn't know whether to be excited or nervous. Later that day, while I was out getting us some drinks by the pool, I spotted her again. This time, she wasn't alone. Jason was standing beside her, talking, his body turned just slightly toward her, too close for casual conversation. She laughed at something he said, touching her hair the way she did when she was nervous or interested. I stood there for a moment, just watching them. The easy way they interacted, the laughter, the way she seemed more alive in that moment than she'd been with me in months. My stomach twisted as I walked back over, forcing myself to keep my tone light as I handed her a drink. "Oh, hey!" she exclaimed, sounding more surprised than I expected. "Jason, this is my husband." Jason extended his hand with a smile that was a bit too friendly. "Good to meet you, man. I was just catching up with..." He paused, chuckling. "An old friend." I nodded, gripping his hand firmly. "Good to meet you too." The tension in the air was thick, and I could feel her watching us. They kept talking about the good old days. For a while, trading stories from their high school years, and I forced myself to sit there and listen. But as they talked, I couldn't shake the growing feeling that I was the outsider in my own marriage. As the day turned to evening, I suggested we head to the resort bar for drinks, hoping to pull her attention back to us. But on our way there, we bumped into Jason again, this time by the lobby. He flashed a wide grin when he saw us, lifting his drink in a casual wave. "Mind if I join you guys?" he asked, and before I could respond, she'd already said, "Of course." So there we were, the three of us at a small table, the dim lights casting long shadows. She was caught up in his stories, laughing at every joke, even the ones that weren't that funny. I sat there, trying to be part of the conversation, but each time I spoke, it felt like I was intruding. Eventually, Jason turned to me and said, "You're a lucky guy. This one was the heartbreaker back in the day." He winked at her, and she blushed, looking down at her drink. "Yeah, I am lucky," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "That's why I brought her here. Thought we could use some time together." The words were a gentle reminder, one that seemed to go unnoticed. She just nodded absent-mindedly, her attention drifting back to Jason, her old memories pulling her further away from me with each drink they shared. By the end of the night, it felt like I was sitting across from two strangers. The next morning, I woke up alone in our room. I checked my phone, no messages, no missed calls. I waited around, assuming she'd just gone for breakfast early or maybe was out for a walk. But an hour passed, and still no sign of her. Eventually, I headed out to look for her. The resort wasn't that big, so I figured I'd find her near the pool or by the gardens. I finally spotted her in one of the lounge areas by the lake, sitting at a table with, of course, Jason. They were deep in conversation, her hands moving animatedly as she talked. She looked so alive, like she was pouring herself into the moment, into him. I couldn't help but feel like an outsider, an unwelcome observer of something personal. I walked up, and her face shifted instantly. She smiled, but there was something different in her eyes, a spark I hadn't seen in a long time, but one that didn't seem to be for me. "There you are," I said, keeping my voice light though it felt like I was swallowing glass. "Oh, hey." She looked flustered, almost guilty. "Jason and I were just, reminiscing." "Sure," I said, sitting down beside her. "I just thought we'd spend the day together." Jason cleared his throat. "I actually have some errands to run in town," he said, standing up and giving her a look. "Maybe we can all catch up later?" I watched him walk away, then turned to her. "So, what's going on?" She looked down, fidgeting with her coffee cup. "It's nothing," she said softly. "It's just old memories." After that morning, things grew tense between us. She kept trying to reassure me that it was nothing, that Jason was just a friend from a different time in her life. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, a wall that hadn't been there before. That afternoon, we went to a local winery. I thought it would be just us, but halfway through our tasting, I caught her looking over her shoulder, checking her phone repeatedly. And not long after, Jason showed up. She gave me an apologetic look, murmuring, "I might have mentioned we were coming here." I forced a smile and nodded, watching them share inside jokes and lean a little too close. Her laugh was different around him, less reserved, more uninhibited. I found myself wondering if she was remembering the person she used to be before we got married, before kids and mortgages. Maybe she missed that version of herself. But what about us? Didn't she miss us? By evening, I was drained. I suggested heading back to the room, hoping she'd come with me, but she hesitated. "Jason invited me to see this live band at a bar nearby," she said, avoiding my gaze. "Would you be okay if I went?" My chest tightened. "You're asking if I'm okay with you spending more time with him?" "It's just for a little while," she said, forcing a smile. "I'll be back soon, I promise." I nodded, watching her walk away with him, her hand brushing his arm as they left the winery. And just like that, I was alone. Hours passed, and she still wasn't back. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone, watching the minutes tick by. I'd sent a couple of casual texts, just asking if she was okay, but her responses were brief. "I'm fine," or "Be back soon." The hotel room felt cold, the silence growing heavier with each passing hour. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that she'd be back any minute, laughing about the music or telling me some funny story about the bar. But by midnight, I stopped lying to myself. I had to face the truth. Something was happening between them, whether she admitted it or not. Finally, around 1 a.m., the door creaked open. She slipped in quietly, tiptoeing as if she was hoping I'd already be asleep. She froze when she saw me sitting there in the dark, her eyes wide. "Oh, you're still up," she murmured, looking anywhere but at me. I nodded slowly, biting back the questions swirling in my mind. How was it? She hesitated, brushing her hair back. It was nice. Jason's just, well, he's easy to talk to, you know. Sure, I replied, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. Nice enough to keep you out till 1 in the morning? She let out a sigh, clearly tired. Look, let's not do this right now. I just need some sleep. Without waiting for a response, she climbed into bed, turning her back to me. The distance between us and that bed felt like miles. And as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I knew deep down, something had shifted beyond repair. The next morning, she was already dressed and gathering her things by the time I woke up. Her eyes darted away from mine as she stuffed her phone and wallet into her bag. I thought we'd do something together today, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She paused, her back to me. I told Jason I'd help him with something in town. It won't take long. She glanced over her shoulder, as if waiting for me to argue. So, he's your priority now? I couldn't keep the frustration out of my voice this time. Her face tightened, but she stayed quiet. It's just a quick thing, she mumbled, almost too softly to hear. And before I could respond, she was out the door. I spent the rest of the morning wandering around the resort, unsure whether to feel angry, sad, or both. Every time I saw a couple walking hand in hand or sitting close, I felt a bitter pang. What had happened to us? Was this whole trip just a cruel reminder of what was missing? Around noon, I spotted her sitting outside one of the coffee shops in town, Jason by her side. She was laughing, her whole face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in ages. She looked so alive. The kind of smile I thought was reserved for us. They were leaning in close, heads almost touching, like they were the only two people in the world. Watching them, I felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't just two old friends reconnecting. There was an intimacy there, something deeper, something I was no longer a part of. When she finally returned to our room that afternoon, I didn't bother hiding my frustration. She barely looked at me as she walked in, and I could feel the tension tightening around us like a vice. So, are we going to talk about what's going on? I asked, my voice low but firm. She set her bag down, avoiding my gaze. What do you mean? Come on. You've been with him practically every second of this trip. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. This wasn't supposed to be a vacation for you and Jason. She finally looked at me, her expression shifting from defensiveness to something like guilt. He's just someone who knew me before. Before all the stress, the routines, everything. I guess I missed that version of myself. I nodded slowly, taking in her words. And where does that leave us? She looked down, fiddling with her wedding ring. I don't know. I didn't plan any of this, but being around him, it's like I remember a part of me I haven't seen in a long time. So you're just going to throw everything we've built away? Over a memory? She shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. I don't want to hurt you. But I feel, I don't know, trapped in a life I don't recognize sometimes. Her words cut deep, deeper than I'd expected. I took a step back, the weight of her confession settling over me. I thought this trip would bring us closer, but now, it felt like it was tearing us apart piece by piece. And as I looked at her, I realized I wasn't even sure who she was anymore. That evening, I suggested we go to dinner, just us, no interruptions. She hesitated, but eventually nodded. We ate in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, barely touching the food on our plates. I tried to make conversation, asking her about anything, hoping to bridge the widening gap, but each attempt fell flat, met with distant replies and forced smiles. When we got back to the room, I told her I wanted us to spend the night just talking, laying everything out, figuring out where we stood. She looked worn, as if the weight of her own thoughts had become too much. Maybe we should give each other some space tonight, she said quietly. Space? I repeated, my heart sinking. She nodded, fiddling with her phone. I think it might help clear my head. I just need to figure things out. Are you meeting him? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop myself. I already knew the answer. She didn't deny it. I'm sorry, she whispered, grabbing her purse and slipping out the door, leaving me alone in that dark, quiet room. I sat there, staring at the closed door, my mind numb. She'd chosen him, at least for tonight. I didn't sleep at all. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the trip, every missed sign, every second I'd spent hoping things would get better. She didn't return that night. And by the time the first light crept through the window, I'd reached a quiet, hollow acceptance. I'd lost her, at least for now. Around 7 a.m., the door creaked open. She slipped inside, trying to be quiet, her eyes red and swollen. She looked at me, her expression unreadable. Did you even come back to sleep? I asked, not bothering to mask the bitterness in my voice. She hesitated, setting her purse down. No. I stayed with him. We just talked, about everything. Right, I replied, not believing it for a second. She looked away, ashamed, fumbling for words. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Seeing him just brought up things I thought I'd moved past. And what about us? What did we bring up for you? She bit her lip, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. I'm just so confused. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Maybe it's time to end this trip. She nodded, her shoulders slumping in relief or maybe defeat. I wasn't sure which. All I knew was that, on the drive home, the silence between us said everything neither of us was willing to admit out loud. When we finally pulled up to our house, I waited for her to gather her things, but she hesitated. She looked over at me, her face a mix of regret and uncertainty. I think I need some time away, she said, her voice barely audible. To clear my head, figure things out. Jason offered to let me stay with him for a while. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I didn't respond. I couldn't. I watched as she stepped out of the car, slowly pulling her suitcase from the trunk. She lingered, as if waiting for me to say something, anything to make this right. But what was left to say? Finally, she turned and started down the driveway, glancing back once before getting into a waiting car at the curb. Jason was driving. They pulled away, and I just sat there, numb, the weight of her absence settling heavily over me. After a long time, I finally drove away, leaving the house, our life, and everything I thought we built behind. It felt like more than the end of a trip, it felt like the end of us. Coming home alone felt surreal. The quietness of the house was suffocating, every corner a reminder of her absence. Her things were still scattered around, her shoes by the door, a sweater draped over the couch, a coffee mug left on the counter. The weight of it all hit me, each little piece a relic of a life we had shared and a future I wasn't sure existed anymore. I dropped my bags by the door and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the full reality settle in. The anger, the sadness, the betrayal, it all surged at once. I wanted answers, wanted to know why it had come to this, how the person I thought I knew had become a stranger in such a short time. I tried to sleep, but every creak in the house, every shadow seemed to bring her presence back. Memories flashed through my mind, our first night in this home, late-night talks, even the arguments that seemed so trivial now. This was supposed to be our life, our home. But now, it was just a hollow shell. At some point in the night, I picked up my phone, scrolling through old photos of us, laughing, smiling, unaware of the cracks that would come. I stared at her number, thumb hovering over the call button, but what would I say? What could I ask that I didn't already know? Instead, I set the phone down, knowing that whatever words I wanted to say, whatever pleas I wanted to make, she wasn't here to hear them. A few days passed, each one dragging longer than the last. I tried to keep busy, went back to work, anything to distract myself from the quiet in the house. But every time I got home, that emptiness hit all over again. I knew I couldn't keep this up, pretending like nothing had changed. One evening, my friend Mark stopped by, unannounced. He'd been calling, but I'd ignored most of his messages. He knew something was up, and there was no avoiding it now. Man, you look like hell, he said, stepping into the house and taking in the scattered dishes, the unpacked bags. He didn't wait for me to invite him to sit, he just dropped onto the couch and patted the seat beside him. I sat down heavily, running a hand over my face. It's over, Mark. She's staying with someone else. Someone from her past. Mark's face hardened. You mean she left you for some guy she just happened to run into? I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. Yeah. And I don't even know how long it's been going on, or if it started here. All I know is she left with him, no explanations, no promises, just left. Mark shook his head, a mix of anger and disbelief. You don't deserve this, man. You've been giving everything to her, to this life. She's the one throwing it away. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of it all settling between us. Eventually, he patted my shoulder. Whatever you need, I'm here. And remember, this doesn't define you. You're worth more than someone who's willing to just walk away. Hearing it from someone else, that validation, was a relief. But as he left, I realized that I was still left with the same question: how do I move on from a life that no longer felt like my own? The days turned into weeks, and gradually, the pain shifted from sharp to a dull ache. I began clearing out little things around the house: her forgotten scarf on the chair, the pair of shoes she always left by the door. With each item I tucked away, it felt like I was slowly reclaiming my space, turning our home back into my own. One evening I received a text from her. It was brief, almost businesslike, as if she was trying to detach herself from any emotion. I need to come by and pick up a few things. Is tomorrow okay? I stared at the message for a long time before replying. Sure. Just let me know when. The next day, I made sure to be out. I didn't want to see her or risk another conversation that would dredge up everything I was struggling to put behind me. I didn't need her explanations, her apologies, or her guilt. I just needed to let go. When I returned that evening, her things were gone, and the house felt different, lighter, almost. I walked around, noticing the empty spaces left behind, but instead of sadness, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. In the weeks that followed, I focused on myself. I reconnected with friends, took on projects I'd been putting off, and allowed myself to rediscover who I was outside of her shadow. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something like hope. There would always be scars, reminders of a love that once was. But slowly, day by day, I began to believe that there was life after her, and maybe even a better one. The next day, things came to a head. We'd planned to drive up the coast, do some hiking, maybe catch a sunset. But she seemed distant, barely looking at me or saying much. And at every opportunity, she was on her phone, checking messages and quickly putting it away when I got close. By noon, I'd had enough. We stopped at a lookout point, and I turned to her, finally deciding to confront what had been building up since that night at the bar. What's going on? I asked, trying to keep my tone steady. You've been acting weird since Matt showed up. She looked at me, a flicker of surprise in her eyes, but it quickly turned into frustration. What are you talking about? I mean, are you here with me, or are you here with someone else? The words were out before I could stop them, my voice sounding harsher than I intended. She sighed, crossing her arms, looking away from me. You're being ridiculous. But I wasn't about to back down. Am I? I asked. Because you're glued to your phone, sneaking off, giving me vague answers. It's like you're not even here with me. She was silent for a long moment, just staring out at the ocean. And then, finally, she said, You don't get it. It was just good to see someone who knew me back then. It's not like we can't have friends from our past, right? That would have sounded reasonable, if it weren't for the look in her eyes. She was hiding something, I knew it. The rest of the day, I barely spoke, and neither did she. We were just two people sitting in silence, pretending to enjoy the view, but miles apart. And as much as I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, a part of me was already starting to feel like I knew exactly what was happening. That night, we returned to the hotel in silence. I'd stopped trying to bridge the distance, and she seemed more wrapped up in her own thoughts than ever. I lay there, staring at the ceiling again, while she scrolled through her phone, pretending like I didn't exist. Around 10:30, she got up and started getting dressed. "I'm just going to get some air," she mumbled, not making eye contact. "I need to clear my head." I sat up, feeling something inside me snap. "Where are you really going?" She stopped, looking at me with something between anger and guilt. "Why are you doing this?" "I'm just going for a walk." "Then let's go together," I said, trying to keep my voice calm but feeling the anger rise. But she shook her head, her face hardening. "Why do you have to be so controlling?" She shot back, voice low but biting. "I'm not a kid. I can go for a walk by myself." And with that, she grabbed her coat and walked out, leaving me sitting there, staring after her. A part of me wanted to follow her, but I stopped myself. I didn't want to be that guy. I didn't want to be paranoid, desperate, following her down the street like some jealous stalker. But as the minutes turned into an hour, then 2, my patience wore thin. Finally, I went down to the lobby, hoping she'd be there, maybe just lost in thought. But she was nowhere in sight. The hotel clerk gave me a sympathetic look as I asked if he'd seen her. "She left about an hour ago," he said, shrugging. "Didn't say where she was going." I went back to the room, feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. The empty bed, her things scattered around, it all felt like a mockery. I sat there, waiting, not knowing what I'd say when she got back but knowing that whatever trust one had left was hanging by a thread. She finally returned around 2 a.m., and the moment she walked through the door, I could tell. Her face had this tired, almost hollow look, and she avoided my eyes as she quietly slipped off her shoes and jacket. She moved like she was trying to tiptoe around broken glass, not wanting to disturb anything, but her silence was deafening. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. She hesitated, barely glancing at me. "Just out," she said, almost like she was too tired to come up with an excuse. I couldn't take it anymore. "Did you see him? Just tell me." Her face flushed, and she opened her mouth as if to deny it, but the lie died on her lips. She looked away, her jaw tight. "I needed closure," she finally said, barely above a whisper. "Closure?" I repeated, the word hanging heavy in the air between us. "Is that what you call it?" She flinched, and for a second, I saw the guilt flash across her face. "It's not what you think," she said, but the words sounded hollow, even to her. I stood up, feeling this numbness wash over me. "So, that's it then? After everything we've been through, after all these years, you're just going to throw it all away for some memory?" She didn't answer, and in that silence, I felt something in me break. I grabbed my jacket and headed toward the door, not caring where I was going, just needing to get out of that room, away from her, away from everything. As I walked out, she didn't stop me, didn't call after me. She just stood there, her expression blank, like she was as lost as I was. I walked for hours, not caring where I was going, just letting the cold night air clear my head. My thoughts kept circling back to everything she'd said, or rather, everything she hadn't said. The silence, the vague excuses, the way she couldn't look me in the eye. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened with Matt had crossed a line, one we couldn't go back from. By dawn, I found myself back at the hotel. I climbed the stairs slowly, dreading what I'd find, feeling the weight of what I had to do settle in my chest. When I entered the room, she was still awake, sitting by the window, staring blankly out at the street. She didn't look surprised to see me, didn't ask where I'd been. I took a deep breath, forcing the words out. "I'm going back home." She finally looked at me, a flash of something in her eyes, panic, maybe, or regret. "Please," she started, but I held up a hand, stopping her. "I needed this trip to mean something, a chance for us to get back to what we used to be," I said quietly. "But you made your choice." She opened her mouth to speak, maybe to explain, maybe to apologize, but whatever she was going to say, it didn't matter. I'd already made up my mind. I turned away, grabbing my things, packing in silence while she sat there, watching. "I'll call you when I get home," I said as I reached the door, my voice sounding distant even to myself. And then, without another word, I walked out, leaving her behind, feeling like a part of me was still left in that room. The drive back felt surreal. The entire trip home, memories of our years together flashed in my mind, but each one felt tainted now, like I couldn't trust anything I thought I knew about us. I kept wondering if there was something I'd missed, signs that could have told me things were breaking beneath the surface long before we'd left for this trip. When I got home, the house felt empty in a way I hadn't expected. I dropped my bags and just stood there, taking it all in, feeling the weight of it hit me. I'd never pictured a future that didn't have her in it, and now here I was, alone, feeling like I was in someone else's life. Days passed in a haze. She texted a couple of times, saying she'd stay with a friend for a while to give me space, but I barely responded. I didn't know how to answer her anymore. I'd planned to talk things out, to see if there was anything left worth saving, but every time I tried to find the words, I felt this knot in my chest that told me the damage was done. One night, I finally called her. There was a long silence when she picked up, either of us knowing what to say. Finally, I broke the silence. "Why, Sarah?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why him?" She let out a shaky breath, and for the first time, I heard the crack in her own voice. "I don't know," she admitted, sounding as lost as I felt. "It was just something familiar. Something I thought I needed." The words stung, but they didn't surprise me. We sat in silence for a long time, both of us realizing that whatever we'd once had was slipping away, and there was nothing left to hold on to. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, hit like and leave a comment with your favorite part. We'd love to hear your perspective.